Steffes, the chair of the education department. And this is the first event in our department series. We have a programming committee of faculty, staff, and students that are working on more programming for the year. So there'll be future announcements to come. But I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Mahasan Chaney, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. Dr. Chaney received her PhD in education policy from the University of California, Berkeley. Her BA in ethnic studies and sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and MS in education policy from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Chaney held a National Academy of Education Spencer Dissertation Fellowship and is currently working on a book project about federal education policy and the disciplining politics of opportunity. And she's going to be sharing that work with us tonight. So Dr. Chaney is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for 30 minutes of questions and answers. At any time, you can put a question into the chat, and we will also call in participants. In the participants tab, you can use the raise hand function to get in the queue. I'll moderate the Q&A, pulling both from the chat and from speakers in the queue. So if we were in the room together, we would all be able to give her a loud, warm welcome and round of applause. So let me just say again, thank you, Dr. Chaney, for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tracy, for that introduction and for inviting me today. And thank you also to Kelsey for helping to arrange this talk this evening. So tonight I'm going to share some work from the manuscript I'm preparing and discuss a little bit about my broader research agenda, which explores the intersection between educational policy, the racialized politics of punishment, and what I've come to call the disciplining politics of opportunity, which I'll define soon. But before getting into the specifics, I thought I might start by sharing a little bit about how I became interested in the specific policy questions around school discipline and education. There we go. So I've always been interested in the ways educational inequality is perpetuated by school discipline practices that disproportionately impact Black children. I saw this in the schools that I attended. I'm gonna handle this dog, thank you. And after graduating, I got a job coordinating a restorative justice program that was modeled after a youth court system. So to describe a little bit about that program, when students got in trouble, they might be referred to see me, where instead of being suspended, their peers would assign them alternative consequences. So if you got into a fight, you might be assigned counseling. If students had problems with their studies, or if they were caught cheating, they might receive tutoring. We also assigned community service, jury duty on the youth court, or any number of consequences that might help students to repair the harm that they caused. But when I was doing this work, I also noticed that the program, far from interrupting in what critics have termed this school to prison pipeline, it actually served as a microcosm of the broader criminal justice structure. And by that, I mean that students who were likely to get in trouble to be referred to the program were Black and Latinx students. And students who were more likely to serve as student advocates or the lawyers representing them in this youth court proceeding were middle-class white students who would also use the experience in the program to help bolster their college applications. So this reform to disrupt the school to prison pipeline, perhaps more accurately, helped to facilitate the criminal justice structure in the school. And so this was almost a training program to prepare students for what a court structure might look like. So yes, students helped to acknowledge the harm that they caused, but the program did very little to intervene in the racialized structure that caused harm in the first place. So how was it that Black students were suspended more than other students? And research in this area suggests a range of answers. Often they discuss that Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective reasons. So students' behavior is more likely to be seen by teachers as irate, insubordinate, disrespectful, uncooperative. And also white teachers are more likely to see Black students as habitually causing trouble. And in a subsequent research project, I worked with a teacher in a different school district, and I interviewed him about the restorative justice program that they were doing. And he offered a critique that I just really never have forgotten. And he says, it's funny, how do you restore justice? I feel when you are talking about the restorative justice in a school that is surrounded by injustices, in a school whose very existence depends on inequity, I'm wondering, what are we doing and who is the restorative justice for? And so this experience led me to think more intently about not only the scope of school discipline, but to understand how injustices are reproduced, and also to think critically about how policies and reforms designed to bring about equality end up reproducing the punitive and indeed anti-Black practices that I witnessed in the schools that I worked at. So the problem of discriminatory discipline practices I have since decided to study are practices that are not just problems of schools that I worked at or of the teachers or even urban schools more generally. Rather, research in a broad range of fields illuminates how schools, like any number of public institutions, county hospitals, welfare offices, for example, are engaged in similar projects of disciplining, regulating, and criminalizing. The problem of race-based discipline disproportionality is thus a problem of social policy making. So my broader research agenda argues that understanding school discipline requires examining how schools, as a key site of US social policy provision, impose practices that mirror the regulating forces of other welfare state programs. Indeed, since the 1960s, education has become a key feature of federal social policy provision. And these cases that I study include the 1960s Great Society, the 1980s, which I'll talk about today, and the 1990s. And these questions require us to look beyond the local level at how federal policymakers have contributed to these practices. And doing so broadens the scope of how we understand school discipline. And each of these periods merge social policies with crime control. So the 1960s Great Society, the 1980s, we see a rise of mass incarceration, and the 1990s, we saw an uptick in federal crime law. But these also coincide with critical reforms in federal education. So even if we tend to see them as separate, seeing them together reframes the purposes, functions, and roles of federal educational policy as that which does more than just impose standards or fund schools, but that has actively shaped the criminalizing practices of Black students. My talk today will describe what I call the disciplining politics of opportunity. I will demonstrate that federal policymakers have used education reforms and employed discourses of opportunity to promote stricter school rules. I'm going to demonstrate how this is employed in the 1980s and how federal policymakers used one of the most critical education reports of the past 40 years, A Nation at Risk, to embark on a media campaign to employ stricter school reforms. In each of these periods, I'm interested in educational opportunity as both policy and as discourse. And I use the term opportunity in this context to mean the idea that education can serve as the primary institution to bring about racial equality and social economic mobility. Policies, for me, these opportunity policies might include any range of things. My work itself studies Title I, which sends money to low-income schools. But I'm also interested in how this operates in the form of discourse. So we might think about these ideas that education might help you educate yourself out of poverty instead of any other number of reforms, or like I will talk about today, school discipline is seen as the civil rights issue of our time. And my work finds that policymakers come to define opportunity in education in relation to a presumed Black criminality, defined broadly as protest, school disruption, or one's potential to create violence. And at times, education policy functions as a disciplining force or a tool of governance in which federal policymakers use education policy to address problems of poverty and come to consistently name, sort, categorize, and regulate behavior through these education initiatives. Over time, however, I find that policymakers use a discourse of opportunity and these existing policy structures to impose more stricter school discipline. So the onset of school rules, the practices of suspension, removal, any technologies of surveillance, or also increased police presence in schools. And today I'm going to talk more specifically again about how this disciplining politics was at the core of the 1980s excellence in education movement, when a wide range of researchers and government actors employed a variety of strategies to improve the nation's schools. Briefly, I will say that my work is based primarily on archival data found in the Reagan administration's presidential library. And I looked through a number of documents and files that illuminate specifically how the administration described the relationship between school indiscipline, educational ineffectiveness, and race-based opportunity. Most notably, I found a number of files that related to the actual subject of discipline in schools. And I triangulated these documents with internal memos, news clippings, presidential speeches, congressional hearings, and also secondary accounts of the Reagan administration. So to start, students and scholars of education will have some familiarity with the 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, but to refresh our memories or to introduce this to folks who are here who may not be as familiar with educational policy, the National Commission on Excellence in Education called attention to what they saw as this rising tide of mediocrity in the nation's schools and recommended a new focus on what they called educational excellence, one that paired the nation's economic success with the academic rigor of the classroom. The authors recommended that educational excellence meant overhauling the high school curriculum by requiring more courses in math, English, science, and social studies. And it also called for a longer school day, a longer school year, more homework, and more testing for students. But overall, the excellence movement in education, spearheaded in part by the report, has been termed like a seismic impact on the education in the years that followed. So for the first time, the public ranked education as a top national concern. It changed state policy such that state legislators increased their spending on schools, established new curricular and achievement standards. And by focusing its analysis on the economic impact of schools, it also rejected the broader view that school performance was a result of socioeconomic and societal forces, and therefore challenged the ways we imagine the goals of federal education reform. Whereas the 1960s federal policies were geared towards equalizing education through extending federal dollars to low-income schools, the report challenged the notion that education equity by discrediting the social policies of the 1960s and focusing more intently on educational outputs and standards. And these are all important in their own right, but I'm interested also in the ways the administration used the report and the excellence movement to promote their own agenda to criminalize school disorder. Adding their own message to the commission's report, the Reagan administration made sure to emphasize that if educational standards had declined, as A Nation at Risk reported, it was because learning had been crowded out by alcohol, drugs, and crime. And without attending to Reagan's efforts to impose discipline and halt violence, I argue that we have misread the full legacy of the excellence movement. In the years following the report, the administration used the momentum created around school reform to publicize what they saw as the real problem with schools: disorder, crime, and violence. And it did so by sponsoring a new report, which I'll talk about next, creating a media campaign that promoted these ideas that schools, and more specifically urban schools, were violent. And in doing so, they argued that the real educational equity problem in schools had little to do with funding or existing civil rights protections, but that of school disorder. So just 4 months after A Nation at Risk was released, President Reagan and Secretary of Education Terrell Bell established a working group to produce another report on education, this time about the problem of school disorder. When The Nation at Risk is read alongside this report, Disorder in Our Public Schools, it is clear that the administration's interest was to use the fear of decreased standards to offer its own solutions for federally led but locally implemented reform to criminalize student disorder. And although it was released as an internal memorandum and without the fanfare of the more famous A Nation at Risk, the working group's report, originally titled Chaos in the Classroom, positioned the problem of school discipline and violence as a central component of the rising undisciplined and criminal risk facing the nation. In other words, if the economy was bad because schools were bad because bad kids were bad. So this 23-page report included selective evidence to describe not just the obstacles discipline posed for education, but focused more on the criminal aspects of school disorder. And most of the alarming data points came from a 1978 National Institute of Education study, which described the physical attacks that happened in American secondary schools, that described the ways students were robbed with forces of threat, or that secondary children were victims of school and crime each day, and goes on to discuss the nature of the violence problem in schools. And just days after the report was released, the president and administrative aides reported that Reagan's speech and a fact sheet about school discipline were sent to editors, columnists across the country. And they also scheduled House and Senate committees. And so they were well on their way to nationalizing this crisis of increased crime and disorder in the nation's schools. Now, one way to promote the criminal aspects of school disorder was to weaponize teachers' professional concerns for order in the classroom. So the Reagan administration used the ideas that teachers' professional rights and teachers' safety against students. As one memo laid clear, the underlying rationale for the initiative was, quote, the restoration of the status and authority of school officials vis-a-vis students, which court decisions and bankrupt liberal values of the 70s had sharply undermined. In other instances, the discipline report described the violence faced by teachers in big city junior high schools, including a shocking report of a teacher in New Orleans who, quote, watched while two boys threw a smaller child off a second floor balcony, and of high school girls in Los Angeles who, quote, angry over low grades, tossed lighted matches at their teachers, setting her hair on fire. And teachers overall provided mixed support for Reagan's discipline initiative. On one end, Albert Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, was quite supportive. He invited Reagan to speak at the union's Los Angeles convention in July of 1983. And as one news article at the time noted, although some delegates at the convention staged a quiet walkout against Reagan, who they saw as anti-labor and anti-public education, the president nonetheless received, quote, several points of hearty applause, the loudest of which came when the president described his shared interest in the Federation's stance on school discipline. Now, educators had long advocated for stricter school discipline as a way to advocate for their professional rights. And although Shanker, quote, distanced himself from the president in general terms, he nonetheless praised the president for raising the discipline issue. As he recalled, I can't remember a president of the United States ever saying we may do something about the discipline problem. But others, like the president of the National Education Association, argued that although schools faced discipline issues, public schools were not, quote, blackboard jungles, as the Reagan administration seemed to imply. And so even though the administration cited teacher survey data that said that the problem of school discipline was increasing, others argued that instead, by 1983, the numbers of teachers reporting that discipline impaired their ability to teach had actually been on the decline. And over and over, they mentioned that although discipline was an issue, violence was not a major problem that the educators faced. Yet, even though teachers did not see criminal behavior and violence as a major obstacle of school discipline, the Reagan administration nonetheless weaponized teachers' concerns for their professional rights against urban school children that unions like the AFT represented. Instead, they lumped all disorder, disruption, speaking out of turn, students sleeping in class, into a category of criminal or that which would lead to criminal behavior. And even the chairman of the discipline report testified before the US Senate that crime statistics were the best available data on the lack of school discipline in American schools, even if criminal behavior was, quote, only part of the problem. And again, Reagan emphasized this issue that violence was an issue for teachers in speeches and his radio announcements. The school discipline report continued to mention that in some schools, teachers suffered verbal and physical abuse. They went on to say that teachers were in constant fear of brutal outbreak of violence in the schools by students, and that this was particularly a problem in larger cities where intruders from the surrounding neighborhoods were a constant cause of fear for the teachers. And they also continued that white teachers who taught in predominantly minority schools were, quote, 7 times more likely to be attacked and in need of medical attention. And although the administration cited this data that teachers were constantly being assaulted, other reports estimated that the teachers assaulted represented less than 1% of all teachers. So one way, again, to promote the problem of school discipline was to join forces with educators who, of course, had interest in maintaining school order. But in doing so, they lumped all sorts of school disruptions into more criminal problems of violence and attacks. And to be clear, by soliciting teachers who worked in urban schools and making the problem of school disorder one that specifically harmed teachers in urban schools, this broad-based media campaign against school disorder was one about urban students and thus implicitly about the Black and brown students who occupied them. Now, of course, civil rights groups and Black educators had long voiced concerns about the civil rights implications behind punishing Black children. In the 1960s and 70s, for instance, Black activists worried that efforts to increase punitive discipline practices or place police on school campuses would place Black students in danger of, quote, over-policing. Yet civil rights reports, again, in the 70s also took notice of the racial discrepancies in school discipline. One report, for instance, found that Black students were suspended at twice the rate of any other group. School suspensions, they concluded, were more likely to hurt children who were Black, poor, older, and male. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare similarly concluded that in many hundreds of school systems throughout the nation, minority children are receiving a disproportionate number of discipline actions in the form of expulsion, suspensions, and are being suspended for longer periods than non-minority children. Yet, despite ongoing charges of systemic race-based school discipline violations, the Reagan administration denounced racial discrimination or concerns that their discipline campaign was meant to be anti-minority. Instead, the report and internal memos between staff attempted to sell the problem of school disorder as being in the interest of inner city and minority children. The authors of the memorandum, for example, wrote that, quote, "The hard-won right of minority children to an equal educational opportunity is being jeopardized by unsafe and disorderly schools. Permitting the current deterioration of order in the public schools to continue would be anti-minority in the most fundamental sense." In another section of the report, the authors went as far as to claim that the problem of school disorder was the most significant and perhaps the most overlooked civil rights issue of the 1980s. And it's not just that they attempted, I'd argue successfully, to sell this as a civil rights issue, but worse off, the administration relocated the problem of civil rights not from structural forces that ordered racial inequality, segregated schools, and left city schools economically vulnerable, but to the behavior, or rather the misbehavior, of children, and simultaneously used the problem of disorder to back out of other civil rights enforcements. So the Reagan administration, for instance, cut funds to federal programs like Title I, which again, since 1965 had provided federal dollars to low-income students. Yet repeatedly, Reagan announced that schools serving disadvantaged children did not need more money. Schools simply needed, quote, to restore good old-fashioned discipline. And they also used violence to undermine school busing initiatives. The memorandum described urban school violence and indiscipline as being, quote, at the heart of the busing controversy. Thus, it was not white racism or the failure of courts to redistrict segregated school systems or government abandonment of the goals to enforce integration. Rather, it was the problem of indiscipline and violence that was the major cause of white flight from cities to public schools. And again, one way that the Reagan administration promoted school safety as oppositional to school integration was by promoting the idea of these tough school disciplinarians. These were often Black or Latinx school leaders within urban schools. So principals like Francis Vasquez of the South Bronx, or George McKenna of Los Angeles Washington Preparatory School, or Joe Clark, who all had movies about them, and they're featured here below. But the director of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention argued, for instance, that principals like George McKenna had not only turned his school around without the use of additional spending, but he decreased student demands for school busing with his strict disciplinary approach. So by renouncing other federally led policies, the Reagan administration placed the burden of reform on students believed to be in need of behavioral intervention. But they also placed the weight on the shoulders of school leaders who were already burdened by the political economics challenges of the city schools that they were left in charge of turning around. And I'll start concluding that, of course, not everyone went along with the president's efforts to sell the problem of school crime. One congressman called the campaign, for example, cheap politics. Another congressman, noting that there was inconsistent data about the true nature of the discipline problem, voiced his puzzlement that the problem of school discipline, quote, should attract the undivided attention of the most powerful public official in the world. Thus, Reagan's rhetorical presidency not only reset national goals towards standards and accountability, but the administration's strategy to employ federal leadership against the, quote, unruly forces of student disorder also recast national goals towards stricter school discipline and crime control. The Reagan administration not only sought to cut education funding, shrink programs into block grants, and dismantle the federal Department of Education, but by embracing school discipline reform as a primary focus of their message about education, they sought to expand the punitive reach of federal, state, and local education reform. Moreover, when viewed within the broader punitive context of mass incarceration, the Reagan administration's media campaign to bring attention to the criminal forms of school discipline mirrored his broader media blitz used to justify his war on drugs, rather. Yet his discursive strategy had real effects. As early as 1984, the Department of Education reported that states had begun issuing their own responses to the discipline question. And here's an example from the governor of North Carolina mentioning as much. The Departments of Justice and Education also created the National School Safety Center, which was instituted to provide opinions and legal briefs to districts and local courts working to expel campus crime. And this school safety center was also used to provide data on school crime to the Clinton administration, who would later use the data to fortify zero tolerance policies in the 1990s. Moreover, federal policies and programs would also be used to enforce the broader drug war. So within the White House, the Secretary of Education coordinated with other department secretaries in the cabinet around drugs. The First Lady, Nancy Reagan, headed the campaign to impose anti-drug curriculum. And in addition, policies like the Drug and Safe Free Schools Act passed under the 1986 reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act further focused federal opportunity policy on issues of school safety, disorder, and the war on drugs. Yet another striking legacy of the 1980s federal education politics is not that policymakers had replaced equity with standards, but rather that they had recast race-based opportunity as stricter discipline. The administration's narrowed message amounted again to what I'm seeing as a disciplining politics of opportunity, that advancing educational opportunity to students, particularly in urban schools, required not more money or redistributive policies, but stricter school rules. And by claiming the problem of school disorder as, again, the most significant and perhaps the most overlooked civil rights issue of the 1980s, the administration helped to relocate the problems of educational inequality to the disruptive behaviors of public school children, to notions of pathologized urban disorder, and again, not to broader structure of inequality that had widened urban poverty, including the shrinking tax bases in cities and federal disinvestments from cities and schools. Yet this discursive legacy and attempts to use educational opportunity to frame Black children and urban students as criminal cross political affiliations. So the broader project traces these tendencies across, again, multiple administrations. And as historian Daryl Scott argues, the ideas about Black people as damaged have been used by both conservatives and liberals to make and justify social policy. On the one hand, conservatives use claims of Black pathology and violence to rationalize segregation, justify exclusionary policies, and end welfare programs, much like what we know about Reagan. On the other hand, liberals evoke racial damage imagery to build white sympathy towards Blacks and justify policies of inclusion and rehabilitation. In my own work, I explore how liberals in the 1960s painted urban school students as potentially criminal as a way to expand the education initiatives that Reagan would later try to cut, often employing the same language that liberals themselves had used about urban school students as being criminal. More recently, however, scholars like Michael Dumas have similarly argued that programs like Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative was designed to address persistent opportunity gaps faced by boys and young men of color, similarly constructed Black children as essentially damaged and in need of being fixed. Such reforms, Dumas argues, locates the problem within the bodies of Black boys and young men rather than in the social and economic order. And even beyond federal policy, similar ideological and educational projects are employed in reform models like no excuse schools or even programs that emphasize grit. Lastly, as organizers are leading protests and uprising across the United States in response to state-sanctioned violence, educators too are reckoning with this past. School boards, municipal authorities, and teacher unions, for example, across the US have backed proposals to abolish police from schools. Yet what seems like a new politics also necessitates that educators not only rescind support of policing institutions and tough disciplining structures that they helped, at least discursively, to build, rather it demands too that educators, school reformers, and researchers confront how our own reforms, well-meaning as they are, like the restorative justice programs that I myself helped to facilitate, finally abolish the anti-Black behavioral critiques that pervade policy and research discourse, and instead embrace a politics that centers the political, economic, and race-based systems that breathe real life into racial opportunity. By doing so, we may be one step closer to actually restoring justice. And just a few takeaways, I will say that after leaving, I hope that you all see that federal reformers have shaped punitive school discipline policies. And this problem is not one rooted solely in schools, but have gained support through federal initiatives. That discipline, punishment, and regulation operate through discourses of opportunity that paint education as a viable solution to economic and racial inequality, but that continue to shape reforms around behaviors of Black children. And lastly, that disciplining politics have undergirded major periods of education reform like the 1980s excellence movement. And by acknowledging this underexplored history of federal policy, we have a broader understanding of the role and function of federally led school reforms and their role in merging education policies with crime control. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much. So we'll open it up for questions. And again, you can add questions to the chat, or you can go into the participants tab and use the raise hand feature to get in the queue. So a lot of what you're talking about is the framing and the ideology and the language and discourse around discipline. And I'm wondering what the connection between that is and disciplinary policies and practices. Are federal officials recommending particular practices? Is it that local districts run with the discourse? Could you draw those connections just a little bit?
Yeah, so I think some of those connections are made later on, particularly in the Clinton administration, whereby actual like educational policies like Title I are used to fund school police initiatives. And so you start to see these ideas around zero tolerance reforms, and that you needed to actually adopt stricter policies in order to get some of that money. And so then you start to see the merger. There are some of the discourses that local school reformers might pick up. So if we think about the Reagan administration, for example, that whole excellence campaign spearheaded a number of reforms, and one huge one was that the state governors got involved in shaping education and the goals of school reform. And one of those goals, after all of these initiatives have been passed, for the first time was around these ideas of school safety and violence. And so you start to see some of the federal discourses being employed in these spaces of educational policy making, but you also see these federal policies that, again, were designed to create opportunity being employed to fund stricter school discipline reforms. And so some of those things don't happen until much later, but these earlier discourses are employed and picked up over time.
Great. Edward Hugh, I hope I said your name right.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering whether, honestly, it was very eye-opening, and I personally didn't know a lot of the things that were happening before, so it has been a very helpful presentation for me. I was wondering if you had any if you had any intuition as to how COVID is changing disciplinary practices in schools, especially as like the basic requirement, like in all the places that are physically reopening, they're expecting children to follow extremely high levels of discipline, like organized action for very similar justifications. I feel like I'm hearing throughout of like safety. So I'm wondering if you have any intuitions of this kind of previous history coming down to like COVID being another excuse for extra disciplinary actions towards particular minorities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question about people being actually inside the schools. I imagine one thing that your question brings up, and there were a number of like news reports earlier on that discussed how the virtualness of COVID-19 means that educators are actually in the home with students. So there was a case, like I think in Colorado or something, where a kid had what appeared to be a gun. It turned out to be plastic, and the teacher called the school police onto the family, who showed up 8 hours later or something. So in those instances, you start to see like the virtualness of having people in the homes means that policing institutions are actually with you, and that the surveillance kind of is more virtual, but also brings the school to your house. But these questions about how people are kind of confined within the school space, I imagine you would start to see, certain students not, I imagine that maybe, if someone is appearing to look like they're not following the rules, they're more likely to be watched. So, we know that Black students are more like heavily surveilled in the classroom. So I imagine that just falling out of line with those things might lead to increased kind of disciplining strategies as well, or removal from the school. But yeah, those are good questions. And I think that a number of these news reports are maybe starting to discuss them. But even like there are some friends of mine who are teachers have also talked about some of the things that they are seeing in classes, where like you're kind of telling students how to behave in a Zoom call. So kind of moderating what is protocol or appropriate Zoom decorum.
Thanks.
There's a question from the chat. How do you account for reforming educational policy efficiently and in a standardized manner when so much of it is state dependent? I think that gets at how you're thinking about federal policy driving state and local practice and policy.
State reformers definitely play a role in this. So again, like I was saying, a lot of the governors in the 1980s helped to shape some of what we're seeing. One of the key governors who was in charge of educational reform, Clinton, went on to kind of impose a lot of his ideas around education in the 1990s. But states obviously make a huge difference. It's not the part of the archival stuff that I look at unless it's kind of comes up in the federal stuff that I'm exploring. But we know even more recently, states like California, for instance, have reformed a lot of their school discipline practices such that you cannot suspend students for certain behaviors. So states play a huge role. And they're very important. And I really encourage people to look more at those types of practices.
And are they taking the lead from federal government, or are they innovating on this themselves?
I imagine that it is, now, Obama had a huge thing around reforming school discipline practices. I think that it's, in these types of questions, it's more about national trends than federal trendsetters, although a lot of the policies, again, help segue funds to these practices. So there's a question of like, what is a national trend, and the discourses that are just kind of up in the air that people adopt. And then there are actual federal policies that take money to fund these practices.
Great. Another question from the queue, Maxwell.
Hi. So I just had a little bit of a question. I found it really interesting you're talking about like reformative disciplinary practices over kind of like harsher practices like suspension, expulsion, stuff like that. So I was wondering, I know you talked a little bit like give an example about counseling, a kid for getting in a fight rather than like suspending him. So I was wondering if you had kind of other examples of sort of more reformative disciplinary practices, and then also maybe just like if is there like kind of a concerted effort to like through legislation, either like federal or state, to move towards those like kind of practices right now, or is it kind of, I don't know?
I'm less familiar with the what's happening under Trump, but I will say that in response to your latter question, again, the Office of Civil Rights had a number of discipline, like a number of lawsuits against local districts, so who were accused of practicing racial discriminatory discipline practices. And so they needed to adopt a number of reforms in order to do that. Some of them were restorative justice, some of them were PBIS, which is like behavioral management intervention strategies. And so the ways in which those reforms are put in place often, though, depends on the capacity of the districts that are adopting them. So, for instance, I worked in some schools in California who were forced to adopt these restorative justice practices, but they literally had not the capacity, the money, they barely had training on how to do it. And so what happened was, students would be left kind of to their own devices. One teacher in particular told me that, because they didn't have the resources to fund these types of programs, what they would do, because they weren't allowed to suspend students, was to send students home on like a yellow slip, which essentially means that they got sick for the day. So they'd call the parent and say, hey, can we send your kid home? So again, these practices are being reproduced, even though they may not be called suspension or something like that. But yeah, there are a number of reforms, like maybe circle-based restorative justice practices. But again, it really requires that the districts and the schools have some sort of concerted implementation model and the funding to put them in place. And also requires that the restorative justice practices kind of take into account all of the ways in which harm is reproduced. So you really cannot place it just on the students, but think about any number of inequalities that keep these structures in place. So if we're thinking about behavioral modification, at which point does that require teachers to participate in those structures as well?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
There's a question in the chat. Do you think there are effective ways to implement restorative justice without reflecting society's criminalization of Black people and children? If restorative justice is a substitute for punitive punishment, would that make it a response to disciplinary actions as opposed to a preventative measure? Can restorative justice be used as a preventative measure, or how can we intervene so that students of color are not continuously disproportionately disciplined?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that all of these practices are so worthwhile pursuing. And my concern again is that they're not used in ways that kind of just mirror what they're replacing. So can restorative justice models work? Yeah, absolutely. They do really wonderful jobs where you have community, coordinators who are coming in and are spending so much time with children. And for the first time, kids are feeling like heard and respected. And so it's not to say that there are broad sweeping generalizations that, oh, those things don't work. I would never suggest not trying them. It's that in the school districts that adopt them, at what capacity are they imposing them because they feel like maybe they need to, because this is a discipline, issue? And at what extent is there some real concerted effort to think intently about the actual harms that are happening in the schools? So I think with those types of ideas in place, can these models work? Absolutely. I think there's wonderful examples. And all you have to do is a couple of internet searches to find them. Yeah, so I can't remember the basis of your question, but are there these models that work? Yes, I think also when they're tend to be more youth-led. So even in the example that I used, we talked in the restorative justice program that I coordinated about how we might make it so that it's not so punitive, in the sense that we're modeling it not after a court-based system, but maybe doing something that's more circle-based. It also requires that these programs are working with the disciplinarians in charge of the school. So even the people that I got into the restorative program that I was coordinating, there were people who might have been in trouble, but it really wasn't the offenses that probably would have mirrored a suspension anyway. So I'm talking like really minor infractions, like people throwing pop rocks in the hallway, which is annoying, but they probably weren't going to be suspended. And instead they had to sit through this whole kind of court case model to think about, standing up, acknowledging the harm they caused, which was literally a 5-minute disruption that probably caused more humor for the students than actual pain or disruption. So yeah, I think it requires, again, these like very real concerted efforts to change the ideologies that are inherent in a lot of school systems.
Great. From the queue, Maeve.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I know you mentioned that the part that like the celebrated the Get Tough minority leaders were seen as a positive alternative to busing. So I was wondering how big a role you think busing and the opposition to busing played in like these policies in the Reagan administration's like stances here.
Yeah, I mean, it played a huge role. A lot of the data that they were used to justify these types of reforms, like there was one report that was done in Boston, for instance, and so you see this in the archives, all of these notes about this specific report. And so it's like, as you know, most of the data we're pulling are from the report in Boston about the violence and disruptions on the school buses. So a lot of, Reagan was not particularly pro-busing, and by not particularly, he just was anti-busing. And so a lot of the rationale was about how to discredit some of the beliefs deeply inherent in busing practices in general, so that there was a lot of ideas that if Black children and white children were in schools together, there'd be these outbursts of violence or disorder. There's also these beliefs that, and coming from researchers themselves, that the reason why busing didn't work was because you saw all of this white flight happening, and white flight happened because parents didn't want their children to go to school with violent kids. And so, yeah, at the crux of all of this, a lot of it is about this kind of anti-busing strategy, but mainly, again, the beliefs about the children who are being bused. Yeah, and again, yeah, these Black and minority leaders, again, they were just overwhelmingly represented in a lot of the archival data about how important it was for them to take charge of this initiative. And mainly, again, it's because it didn't require any more federal funding, that it also was kind of sponsoring kind of anti-busing on a number of strategies, right? That there was a lot of people in the Black community who said that all we really want is to be in control of our own schools. And so a lot of that discourse was also picked up by a number of policymakers, and like, look, they don't want to be bused either. What they really need are these strong leaders who are going to come in and impose these very strict rules, which they love. And once they have them, then people won't want to be bused anyways. And so there's a lot of these ideas about, what different families want, and what instead of busing these kids out, what can we give them in lieu of them? And so that would be just turnaround schools that had, again, these really strong disciplinarians who had really strict, no nonsense policies.
Great. In the chat, what's your biggest takeaway from the project? How do you think it changed you?
How did it change me? Dang, that's such an interesting question. I think I think that even how I started is probably one way that it changed me, in the sense that I started to kind of reflect on all sorts of things. In some sense, my experience with these projects led me to these questions. But the main way that I think it changed me is that I think a lot of educators or people who do educational research go into it because they want to fix schools. And, there was nothing you could have told me about how harmful schools were based on, these actual practices that are happening every day. So like I said, the schools that I attended were constantly suspending my peers. I myself was on-campus suspension all the time, because I talked too much, And so these were things that led me to study school reform. And once I started to get into the crux of it, I started to think, well, in some ways, and this might be how it changed me, schools are doing what they're designed to do. And if we think about schools as these, real important mechanisms of US social policy provision, you know, we are seeing schools do what they're designed to do. And so focusing so much on the inherent harm of schools and public schools in particular, you know, it kind of further attacks what's left of, you know, the democratic social policies that we do have. And so then you start to see more support for any number of other reforms, including like charter schools or privatizing them. And so I think one way that it may have changed me was to say, you know, how do we think about what's happening here in concert with all of these other things? And how will attacking just schools or just the school to prison pipeline relinquish faults from these other social structures that are in place? You know, schools are doing all that they can and all that they were designed to do, which is a lot, including, you know, the negative things. So I think that I love that question, and I'll think I continue to reflect upon it. Thank you.
From the queue, Samsara.
Hi, yes. We are in the MAT program, and a couple of us have a couple of questions regarding your feelings toward having police be part of a restorative justice approach in schools. If you could tell us a little bit about that. Thank you.
Oh, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so at one of the schools that we're at, they have they follow restorative justice and they have a restorative team. But within that, we noticed that there was a police officer that was a part of that team. We're seeing a little counterintuitive based on what we know, especially considering the population of the school being mostly immigrants, students of color. So we were wondering like your thoughts on that, and even if you have any approaches on like what we should do if we wanted to have that conversation.
It's such a good question. I mean, I think my impulse is probably what yours are, which are eek. You know, essentially too, what these like restorative justice programs are designed to do is to get students to kind of acknowledge the harm that they do. And my one question is, in what part of acknowledging or like admitting something is that then going to be used against a child or a student, you know? So yeah, that raises a lot of concerns for me. You know, but these police officers are present forces in all schools. Like, you know, my restorative justice office was right next to like Officer Wilson's. It was a great guy, but, you know, it was hard to sit in there a lot. And in terms of raising the question, you know, it might be worth just, I wonder if the police sits in, I don't know what the restorative justice model looks like, but I'm curious is if the police officer sits in the circle and hears all of it. I wonder if it's worth asking if they might be able to like remove themselves. But it definitely seems worth bringing up, especially if your concerns around the ways these programs, again, might increase the like criminalizing practices, the ones that they're trying not to resemble. So I don't know about, maybe you can talk to whoever's the figure person in charge of the RJ circle or model and ask them questions about it, and yeah, voice your concerns. Yeah, that's a good question and an interesting one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're running low on time, but if there are any last questions, if someone wants to raise their hand or enter it into the chat, we can probably do one more.
These are fun. Thank you all for raising your questions and asking. I have some incense, sorry.
Yeah.
Raising your questions. Yeah, these are interesting ones for me.
And we're lucky to have Professor Chaney at Brown this year.
Yeah, I'm also teaching a class on these topics. So if you all are curious, I'd be happy to share the syllabus of further reading if folks want to take a look at it.
That would be great. So thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk and a great way to start out our series this year.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Everybody for coming.
Thank you. That was fun.